We're here today to confront a great and consequential evil, to name it, to understand its nature, and to try to understand how it can be fought. Every year, world over, tens of millions of people die and suffer needlessly, all because we've organized our societies in a way that makes it impossible for them to access the healthcare that would prolong and enrich their lives. Sometimes this evil takes the most obvious form, the form of simply prohibiting patients from using and doctors from prescribing the treatments that they judge best. More often, it takes the form of making it the case that such treatments are financially out of reach of people who ought to be able to afford them. But most often, it functions in a much more insidious way, by preventing the process of thought that makes such treatments possible in the first place. It's this that's going to end all of your lives earlier than they need to end, and going to lead to tremendous suffering for you, suffering that could be avoided. In general, for human beings, poverty, misery, and premature death are not due to some people's lacking resources that other people have. Poverty, misery, and premature death is generally caused by the fact that the resources needed to prevent it, needed to prolong and enrich life, haven't been produced in the first place. Think of all the kings and emperors throughout history who died for lack of antibiotics. Not because they weren't rich enough or powerful enough or couldn't command and lord over all the resources at their disposal, the resources at the disposal of the society, but because the resources that would have saved them, resources that are dirt cheap for us, hadn't been discovered, hadn't been made at all. In general, when people die, that's why. Not because some have more than others, but because the knowledge, the technology, the values needed to sustain them haven't been produced. Healthcare, like all other values we need to survive, needs to be identified, valued, and produced by people, produced by the human mind. And in fact, all the points that I'm going to make in this talk are more general than healthcare. They apply to all industries and all values, because all values need to be produced, and all values need to be produced by the mind. But I'm going to talk about how that applies in the specific case of healthcare to frame what it is that's preventing us from having the medicine we could have, from having the life-extending technologies we could have, and from accessing well in ways that integrate with our life and our other values, even those technologies that have already been created. Human beings, as I say, live by producing values, values which we must first conceive of before we can set to work making them. And both conceiving of and producing values is the work of the mind. Think of what this work involves. Conceiving of, thinking of new values, things that fulfill newly identified human needs or fulfill already recognized needs in new ways. Think of the idea of we can end disease now that we know, end certain diseases now that we know what causes them, certain microorganisms, if we can find ways to kill those organisms, kill them without damaging their hosts. It wasn't that people in ancient times knew that and were looking for such potions but couldn't find them. The whole idea of something that could do that could have only come about once we understood what causes sickness, what causes particular sicknesses. And then new ideas are coming up all the time for ways to do these things. New ideas for new technologies that haven't even been thought of to fulfill newly identified needs or fulfill existing ones in new ways. People then need to find ways of acting in pursuit of these values, ways to spend their time developing these new things, delivering them, creating them, producing them. And people need to organize their lives around this pursuit in order to be able to create values at any scale. And then one needs the freedom, one needs to be able to use one's mind to use and dispose of the values one's created in ways that one deems best for oneself. One needs to be able to organize with others as one judges will help one to achieve the values one's seeking to achieve, and to disassociate from others when doing so, that is, associating with them, does not help one achieve these values. All of this requires thought. Human life requires thought. And thinking can only be done by individuals. They can cooperate, but only under the guidance of their own thinking. So if this sort of thinking is going to take place and be implemented, if people are going to discover, create, and produce the things we need to survive, both the medical technologies and everything else, individuals need the freedom to act, each on their own judgment, interacting or not with others as each deems best. Throughout history, very few people had these freedoms, with the result that little was learned, little was created, and people subsisted tenuously in a state of poverty. Without medical care, without much to eat, without much of any kind of technology, for almost all of human history, until about 200 years ago, when suddenly everything started getting better. A little at first, and then very quickly. People had worked out how to live, how to interact with one another, such that enough people were free enough to devote enough of their time to thinking of and creating new values that the human life expectancy has doubled. All those emperors and kings and paupers who died of infections that could have easily been fought with antibiotics, and of a million other things, now live. Yet, the causes of this, the role of the mind and the freedom that it needs to extend human life, has never been well understood. And so, in this period, where we've organized societies better for the first time, freed people up enough that they can create the things they need to live, and to live at scale, there have been many experiments with rolling this back. Many experiments with not letting people function and live as individuals, as they've just been starting to be able to do, but with collectivizing human life, with binding us together so that people can't make choices for themselves, can't think for themselves, can't work to figure out and create the values they need to meet their own needs, but are rather yoked to one another. Industries have been collectivized. Economies, nations, lives have been collectivized. In the most obvious and horrific examples, for example, farming in Russia and China was collectivized, leading immediately to millions of deaths, to people not being able to produce in ways they even could before, with old knowledge not being able to be implemented in the way people need to even the simplest and most well understood tasks in support of human life: famines, death. People backed off from these most dramatic experiments with collectivism, in which even known ways of producing were unable to be implemented. But the effect of binding us to one another, of reintroducing the fetters that hold people together and prevent them from each thinking and living on their own, have been less obvious in many fields. Less obvious where the fetters were less tight, and where what was possible was less well known because less had been accomplished already. Where the effects haven't been obvious horror, but the slowing, the failure to create things that could have been created, the boredom and mediocrity and ossification of what could have been and should have been dynamic, life-enhancing industries. There's a myth that America has something like a free market in medicine, that we're in this way different from other developed countries, which for better or worse have socialized systems, that the Republicans or business interests or the AMA or the right or someone has been fighting against socialized medicine for generations and creating, for better or worse, this free or more capitalist system we have. But it's a myth. It's not true. Most medical dollars are spent by the government in America today, as in other countries. And more importantly, the government controls every aspect of almost every detail of how this money is spent. And the point here isn't that the government is evil or bad. It's that when things are controlled through a government, it's us, it's us controlling one another, not each of us living with the freedom that we need to achieve what we want. Many of the moves towards socialism have happened under allegedly Republican administrations. Many of the moves towards controlling, collectivizing medicine. But more to the point, there's been no real moves backwards, no real moves towards freedom, none to speak of. We're going to hear about the history of this from Amish Adalja in the next talk. What I'm giving now, or trying to give now, is a very general framing for how to think about freedom, individualism versus collectivism in general, and specifically now in medicine. The overall point I want us to focus on, and I want us to think about all day, as we hear from Dr. Adalja about the role of the government in American healthcare throughout its history, as we hear from our panels later about the role of the nature of healthcare financing in America and the nature of healthcare regulation, and as we hear from Don Watkins later about what kind of movement, what kind of change might be possible. What I want us to think about is the role of the mind. Values come from the mind. And anywhere where there's unfreedom, anywhere where there's collectivism, anywhere where people are bound together, the effect of that is always the same. The effect of that is always cutting off and preempting thinking. The effect of that is problems unsolved. Problems unsolved because people aren't free to solve them. And I want to think here about what are the roles that the mind plays in the provision of healthcare. It's the same role that it plays in the provision of every good and service, but how does it look in healthcare, and how is it stifled? First and most obviously, the mind, thinking, is responsible for new medical knowledge and technologies, medical research. A new drug is invented and tested, has to be determined whether it works. The idea for it, from the fundamental research through the clinical trials, something someone has to think about, figure out how to do this better. What are things worth testing? What's the right way to test them? What's the best method? This is the work of the mind. Then, once these results are found, once the drugs exist, once it's known what their effects are, how they work, likewise for surgeries or technologies or devices, there's judgment needed to apply this knowledge and these techniques in a particular case. There's the judgment of the physician diagnosing his patient. Once he's diagnosed him, thinking about what treatments are best for him. There's the judgment of the patient, because a patient isn't just a thing acted on by a physician, but a person who's seeing the physician because he's pursuing his own health. And he has decisions to make about who to see, what services to get, when to get a second opinion. So there's his mind, there's his thinking. There's the clinical judgment of the doctor, and there's the judgment of the consumer of medical care. Behind that, there's the valuing of health and healthcare. It's often assumed, well, everybody values health. Health is an intrinsic value. Health is something everybody needs. But like all values, it's something that has to be integrated into one's wider pursuits in life. People make trade-offs, make decisions all the time take risks to their health. And even within, and decide what things are worth risking, what things are not worth risking. How much do I want to invest in this or that health improvement? How much do I want to change my life? How much do I want to pay for a certain service or treatment? How are these things all related to each other? How do I make these decisions about how to chart my life, how to chart my course through life, pursuing my health and pursuing all the other values that I have in a way where they are harmonious? Moreover, when we think about pursuing health, is it just one thing? There are many decisions to be made. There are many metrics you might be trying to optimize for, many things you might be trying to improve. Is it longevity exactly? Is it health span? Is it ability to do certain activities that you want to make sure you can do for as long as possible in your life, depending on what you want out of life? And as medical technology improves and medical wisdom improves, there are going to be more decisions to be made. There might be certain ways to comport your life if you want to be able to, say, run marathons in your 60s, and others if you want, there might be other things you might want to optimize for. Right? How do we make these decisions? How do we know? This is part of the thinking that doctors have to be doing for patients, that patients have to be doing for themselves, that researchers have to be thinking about. Recognizing that there's not just one thing, the health of the population, or even the health of individuals that need to be maximized, but many different health-related values to be pursued, that different people might weight differently if they had the options. So whatever health values we're pursuing, they're values that need to be integrated by a mind into the whole set of what it's pursuing and guiding its life by. Not just something that everyone needs to have or everyone needs to be provided. And finally, there's a lot of thinking And I think the kind of thinking that's least obvious and most destroyed by collectivization schemes. There's a lot of thinking involved in business models. Thinking about how we should interact with one another, not in the most broad abstract principles by freedom or coercion, but literally, who should I be dealing with, on what terms, what's the arrangements, how many people, how large or small a practice, how should we be sharing this or that, what people am I interacting at, in what ways to achieve the values I want, what are the businesses, what are the business practices, what, if you think about all the different values to do with health that people might be pursuing, or all the different values of any kind that people might need to pursue in life, we pursue them in association with one another. We pursue them working with one another. And there's a lot of thinking to be done about what ways of working with one another, what arrangements are best to achieve what we each want out of life. Different ones for different people at different times. Entrepreneurship is about figuring this out. What are the opportunities? What are the ways of orchestrating things? What are the kinds of organizations that could be set up that could create things that would be valuable to people, values they might not recognize already? There's a lot of thinking there. All of this thinking has to happen in order for the values that would prolong and enrich people's lives, values in any field, but we're focusing on medicine now in particular, to be created, to be available to people, for people to live as long and as healthily as they would like to. But what goes on today? All of this thinking is collectivized, which means that most of it is preempted. Most obviously, we have collectivized payment for medicine now. People don't make their own choices about what kind of coverage to have, even what individual procedures to get, or rather, insofar as they do, they make those choices in a way that's isolated from the cost. You don't decide, how much is it worth to me to see a doctor today? How much is this operation worth to me? How does it relate to other things I might do? Cost is not a factor when you're thinking about that, which means weighting it in your value hierarchy is not a factor when you're thinking about things like that. That thinking is cut off. Moreover, all of the business thinking about what kind of products should be offered, what kind of services should be developed, on what terms might we interact, is skewed or cut off by the fact that people don't have this freedom. All because payment is collectivized. Because the value choices, the choices of how much is this worth to me, aren't in the hands of the people from whom the money is ultimately coming, aren't in the hands of the patients. And because physicians, insurers, hospitals, other kinds of businesses aren't able to therefore come up with different things to offer them to cater to the range of values they might want to have. Do you want your reproductive health care to be paid in the same way as your emergency services care? Do you want mental health care to be bundled with that or sold separately? Do you want to have this kind of health care? Do you want to pay for it? Does it matter to you? What are your convictions on these issues? Some people view certain kinds of health care as immoral that others view as essential, and yet they're all forced to buy them in bundles together. The payment, the deals, the interactions between people are all collectivized. Again, we'll see more about how later. Second, decision-making about what counts as healthcare is collectivized. Who can provide it, in what ways they can provide it, and what kind of care they could have. The judgment about what drugs are safe and effective, about what people are competent to care for other people, are made by central bodies. There's an FDA, there are medical licensing boards. What do these things do? What they do is they take decisions out of the hands of the people who they most directly affect. They tie us together in making these decisions. How do I understand this? What do I mean by this? There are stories, you see movies from time to time, about someone who knows a certain drug is good for his condition, or a certain device or a certain treatment, but it's illegal in his country, and he goes to somewhere else to get it. And maybe he's right. Maybe it works. Maybe there are these people who know better than the regulators what's good for them, and they can do an end run around them, and it's sad when they can't and heroic and exciting when they could. But most people who try to do this are fools. Most people who think they know better than the authorities and the establishment whether a certain vaccine or a certain drug will help them don't. The problem isn't that there are a whole lot of people who know better than the FDA, than the medical licensing boards, and they're prevented from acting on their knowledge. The problem is that the kind of work that would be involved in knowing better than these agencies isn't able to happen in the society we have. It takes a lot of work to figure out what drugs work. It takes a lot of work to figure out what treatment modalities work. All of these things have to be done. Money, time, resources have to be invested in figuring this out. And what a centralized regime of approval of physicians, of drugs, of technologies does is it nationalizes, it socializes, it collectivizes all of that thought. All of the resources that go into working out what drugs to take, what ways to take drugs, what protocols, all have to go through one channel. If you think you have not just you know better what drugs to take right now, but a better way to figure out what drugs would be safe and effective, it would cost you $1 million, $1 billion, many people's man hours over a long time to figure it out. It's not that you know we should take Paxlovid or not, but you have some ideas about how to figure out how to do that. You can't implement them. How could you do it? How could you possibly make money? How could you possibly get a return on the investment when the only one who's allowed to decide whether you're allowed to take it is the FDA? Or in some other country, some other organization. It's all through one decision-making process. And so anyone who has a better idea about the decision-making process can't find a way to do it, can't implement it. The knowledge work can't get done. And this, I think, iterates throughout every aspect of a controlled economy and every aspect of medicine. There are lots of things we don't know. There are sometimes somebody who knows better than the regulators about some particular thing. I should be able to take this drug, it will work, and he can't do it, and that's sad and awful. But it's nothing compared to the stuff that's not known by anybody. Because nobody is free to be able to do the intellectual work and get a return on their intellectual labor. Maybe you're free if you were able to self-finance and fund it to, sit in your lab and do something all on your own, although even that you're sometimes not allowed to do. But if knowledge requires work, then knowledge requires resources. And resources to do the work, you need to get the knowledge. And if you're not allowed to act and implement on that knowledge, then there's no way to monetize the values you create. There's no way, therefore, to afford to do the work. What we have then is whole sections of the economy, whole sections of productive intellectual activity that are forced to happen in a regimented way, and a way where no new, fresh, innovative thinking is possible. Nothing that deviates from the beaten track. Things have to be done as they have to be done, and better ideas aren't welcome. Not just better ideas about particular things, but about how to run this part of the economy, how to create these things. The way I think of it is sort of like a three-legged race, except it's not 3 legs, it's tens of millions, maybe billions. You know how a 3-legged race works? One of your legs is tied to the leg of the person next to you, and then you have to walk with him. And 1, you can't go different places because you're tied together. But 2, you can't even go the same place if you both want to go there without walking very slowly and gingerly and trying to arrange how you each move your leg together. And it's kind of funny and fun because it's an obstacle to overcome when you're walking with one other person. Suppose you're walking with 1 million. Each one's right leg tied to the left leg of the person next to him, and the people, except on either leg, having both of their legs tied. You can't direct your action yourself. You have to kind of somehow merge into a consensus about how to move. And the consensus is unnimble. It's a kind of lowest common denominator lurching forwards. If we can't even walk together, we certainly can't think together. Not like that. And yet that's how we have to think in so many fields. what is happening when we have centralized regulation of how we pay for medicine, of what medicines are allowed to be taken, of who's allowed to prescribe them? What is going on? The problem isn't that there's some work being done by the government or under government orders that shouldn't be done. Again, sometimes that happens, but like extra tests or a third round of trials or whatever it might be to clear some hurdle. It's not that there's busy work or that certain things are being prevented from being done. Again, occasionally that happens. But the bigger issue is that the work is being done in a collectivized manner, in a manner that's subject to all kinds of political pull and machinations, in a manner that's subject to least common denominator effects, in a manner that saps creativity and innovation. What freedom requires is, or rather, what freedom enables is thinking, is everyone thinking for themselves. And what economic freedom is the realm where people are able to do the kind of thinking that we all need to do to chart our lives, to form values, to figure out what we want out of life, to figure it out in detail and in nuance. Not just I want to live rather than die, not just I want to be healthy rather than unhealthy, but like the specific weightings and choices that are needed to be made. Other people then figure out how to provide services that make that possible, discover knowledge that enables new thinking, both on the part of business people and on the part of doctors and on the part of patients, about what kind of health outcomes they want to pursue by what means, and how much they want to pursue them, so that people can then think about what things to offer them, so that prices can develop. There's not an invisible hand that orders the economy to everyone's benefit, that creates a greatest social outcome, if only somehow magically it's allowed to do it. Rather, all the problems inherent in human life have to be solved by human thought. Individuals solve their problems, alone and in consultation and in deals with others, when they're free to do it. And they need the freedom to do it for those solutions to be found, to be implemented, to them to be meticulously tailored to every individual's needs and purposes, because it's the individuals doing the tailoring and their tailors. It's the people who they interact with for this purpose. For new values to be discovered and marketed to people, for people to be inspired to pursue them. There's a kind of dynamism that's possible when people are free to live. And when they're not, what do you have? You have not people achieving and pursuing values, people who want something out of life, know what they want, and shop for it, find people who will give it to them. Other people advertising their wares as, this is what's good for you, I think, I'm going to try to convince you, and here's how to get it. And new and dynamic ways of coming about. What you have is not mutual respect of one mind for another, each trying to achieve their lives for themselves. Rather, you have pittances being doled out by resentful drudges to their wards. And that is the state of healthcare in America today. You show up at the doctor for your pittance. May I have my CAT scan, my MRI, my emergency surgery, my appendectomy? May I have my pills? Please, sir, can I have some more? And the gruel of healthcare is dispensed by people who aren't free to come up with better ways to do it, who are often resentful, to patients who are often resentful of the people giving them the healthcare, resentful of the situation in which they have to get it in. No one knowing why they resent one another, no one knowing why this experience is bad, no one thinking about what it could be. No one thinking about why only these treatments are available and not others. No one thinking about what hasn't been found. No one thinking about why going to the doctor isn't like going to an Apple store. And why? Why do we live this way and die this way? A digression on dying. How do we die? In hospitals or hospices, in some institutional setting, often being kept alive at great expense in periods where we can't do anything that we want in our lives. Often a tremendous amount of the healthcare dollars that are spent on us in our final days when many of us wouldn't even want to be living. There are political issues of who should have the right to end life when and how do you decide it. But even putting that aside, there's something strange about the fact that either cost is no object when we're dealing with end-of-life care, at least not for the individuals making the decisions about whether to be kept alive. They have a right to this care, supposedly, to be kept around like ghouls. Or, on the other hand, no, we have some panel that decides, people imagine, rations out end-of-life care, doles it out. Here's your pittance, your respirator. No thinking about what shape we want our lives to take, how much we want invested in healthcare at different times, what we want the ends of our lives to look like. No customization, or hardly any. And where there is, no thought of price, which means no thought of how much people value the different things they're getting and when they're getting them. Why? Because there's no thought to any of this at all. It's Oliver on the line in that old movie where the gruel, the pittance, is being doled out to him. Because we're not free to even form values about what we want out of our healthcare, or our freedom is so badly constrained. But why? Why can't this be like the products we're free to create and pursue? Why can't there be a free market in healthcare? Well, because people need it, so we're told. And when someone needs something, when they'll die without it, it's heartless or wrong to expect them to pay. Certainly not at the point of service. It's heartless or wrong to regard it as a good on the market. It's obscene in particular if we have a system where the rich can get better healthcare than the poor. Notice that this way of thinking, though, regards healthcare as a static and intrinsic value. The idea that it's something we're all entitled to. One point is, who are we entitled to it from? The people who have to produce it. But I have an even, I think, deeper point. What healthcare is everybody entitled to? What healthcare is it wrong to deny them? The standard of care in 2020? Or 2023? Or 1910? Or 1540? Or 1965? If you think of healthcare not as some static good that needs to be doled out to people, but as something that has to be produced, you recognize that it's produced differently in different times as more knowledge is found, as better things are formed. The mindset where people are owed some kind of basic standard of living is a medieval, pre-modern, static mindset. A mindset where we all have some basic needs that have been met in the same way forever. And it's sad if somebody hasn't been given their gruel, if someone hasn't been given their pittance. They're owed it. But what we want isn't pittances. What we want aren't basic needs. The kind of health care that even the poor among us enjoy now was impossible to anyone, to emperors or kings 100 years ago. Certainly 200 years ago. All the values that we seek in life are, could be, and should be dynamic. They're products, and they're not static products. They're values that somebody thought of as new ways to answer newly discovered or newly better understood needs by human activity. The standards can and should always be changed, always be advancing, and that change is driven by the people who have the resource and interest to devote more time, effort, capital to experimenting with things that are new. Equal healthcare is inherently static healthcare, which means bad healthcare. Not all people do or even should value healthcare or even health equally. There are different risk tolerances, different assessments of what matters most in life, and different amounts of resources. But when we look and say, how sad that so-and-so can't afford the healthcare that so-and-so, some other person can, how wrong it is, we need to create a system that ensures that everybody gets this basic standard. What we're indulging in is a looter mentality. A mentality that sees values somewhere and sees someone else lacking them that doesn't think about where they came from, how things can get better, how there can be more of this in the world, but just thinks he's got it, he doesn't. We need everybody to have what he has. And so we try to arrange things to get the current standard, the thing that some of the better off or upper middle class or whoever has, and make sure everybody has that. We think of it now as the pittance that everyone is owed. But in order to do that, you're standardizing, you're chaining people together, you're cutting off the liberty that people require to come up with new types of values. And so maybe everybody gets a pittance if you manage it, but no more than that. New things aren't discovered. Standards don't advance, or at least they don't advance as much as they could, as much as they should, as much as they would if we were free to do it. The medical mind needs freedom because the human mind needs freedom. It needs freedom from one another, freedom to each act on our own judgment about what we want medically, what our own health goals are, if we're patients, our own judgment about what things are possible and would be good for people, and people would want them if I could create them or bring them to market, if we're medical researchers, if we're entrepreneurs, if we're doctors, the freedom to arrange in whatever kinds of business organizations we deem best to offer these services to people, to convince people of them, the freedom to make decisions. And it's not, again, just the freedom to decide among the options that are there now about how best to satisfy our current desires for healthcare. Because we can't desire even what we're not free to think of. And we're not free to think of things if we don't have the ability to spend our time and resources on coming up with, testing, trying new ideas. People before the iPhone didn't want an iPhone. People before antibiotics didn't want antibiotics. And if the people in line for their pittance, the little bit of food or gruel doled out for them, want lobster or steaks, it's because they see someone across the street with them. But in a world where everybody is like that, there's no across the street to look at. People don't even form the desires, the conception of what they could have, unless there are people free to work for it. We're not in a totalitarian state. It's not like there's no medical freedom or no freedom in other fields. But there's so precious little. And that's, I think, what we're going to see as we go through the other discussions in the panels today. And what I want to think about as we talk about each problem, each difficulty doctors face, each difficulty people in the pharmaceutical industry face, each difficulty patients face thinking about how to achieve their medical goals. What I want to think about is not who's the good guy or the bad guy here. What I want to think about is not who's the person or bureaucrat or something or other standing in the way of their doing more. Not even what's the wrong law. But what I want to think about is what thought is not able to take place here. What processes of thinking are people can do them but they can't act on them, or even worse, they're headed off at the pass. They're undermined by the fact that there's nothing to do if you come up with a new idea. There's no way to implement it. And so therefore, no way to afford to devote resources into this line of thinking. What avenues of thought have been preempted and cut off? Why are things static? This talk is called Liberating the Medical Mind, or Freeing the Medical Mind. So far I've just talked about unfreedom, about the force we live under. What is there to do to set ourselves free on this and in the other field? We'll hear some about solutions later, but I want to say a few things. First, I think understanding the problem, understanding what's wrong with the system you're living under, is valuable even apart from any kind of action, existential action you're going to take to change that system. Understanding why people resent doctors and doctors often resent their patients. Why, if you go into a field because you're excited about solving new problems in this field, because you're excited about helping people, you're excited about providing certain services, you're excited about using your mind in certain ways, why there's so much drudgery, why there's so much misery, why there's so much stagnation, why so many of your days are so gray. Likewise, if you're pursuing healthcare with a patient, or if you're working in any of these industries, why is it? What is this problem? The more you can identify its source, the more you can conceptualize it, the less incoherent the world seems. And the more one's able to focus on the aspects of the industry, the aspects of the product, the aspects of the work that one loves. To see them as islands where, as aspects of it, where you are able to use your mind, to think, to do what you want, to pursue your own values, to think about how you can expand them or reach further them, even in your own life. But just, I think a lot of the desolation of living under force, to any extent and in any field, is there's something incomprehensible about it. What's happening? Things feel wrong. I feel at odds with people. Not because their politics are wrong, though maybe that's a reason to be at odds with them, but just like, why is it that these relationships are strained, that I can't get what I want out of them? Whence this frustration? And I think understanding when one's living under force, and when there are areas of thinking that one would do or could do that are cut off from one, I think that perspective is just very valuable for sanity and for doing one's best work and one's best thinking and shopping from a patient's perspective in a situation where so much of what one should be able to do is precluded from one. But then, if we want to not just endure the system and do our best within it, but we want to change it and improve it, we need to find political solutions. We need to be advocating for something different, for change. And a first step in advocating for change is knowing what we have now. We don't have a free market and we're trying to preserve it or trying to upend it by replacing it with a socialized system that will somehow be fairer. We have a gray, ossified, thoughtless, socialized system in which we're all chained together, each trying in little bits to do his own thinking, his own valuing, pursuing what he wants in his career for his life, but so manacled to one another that we're barely able to move and so able to make so little progress in this. That's what we have now. We have to understand that, and that is the problem before we can think about what are solutions to it. What is the solution? Well, the political solution to everything, I think, ultimately is freedom, which means capitalism, which means treating medicine like all products should be treated, as something that needs to be produced by human minds that need to be free to do it, which means that we have a government that respects the rights of people to choose and protects it, that respects the property rights of people who create things to their property, that understands relationships as trade relationships, and that doesn't try to provide services to people. Concretely, that means we get rid of Medicare, we get rid of Medicaid, we get rid of medical licensing boards, we get rid of the FDA, we get rid of every organization that nationalizes, that socializes, that collectivizes some aspect of the thinking, choosing, directing, producing process by which human beings live, in medicine and in every other field of life. But what does it look like to move towards that? One, there need to be people advocating that. And the advocacy of that needs to be connected with the advocacy of smaller steps, steps that are in that direction, that can be implemented before the whole thing is changed, but that are seen, at least by many of their advocates, as steps towards a better way of living, a better way of organizing our lives. Just as socialists implemented lots of little steps, which they saw as steps towards the collectivism which they viewed as the moral ideal, people who value freedom need to think about what are the steps on the road to it. Some of these steps have been thought of, and we'll hear about some of them later. But they need to be thought of as steps that people might become convinced of, even if they're not convinced of the whole goal, as things that can be advocated for piecemeal on the way to the whole solution, but understood as part of this whole solution by many of the people advocating for them and many of the people getting on board with it. Second, I think in thinking about this progress, what we should be focused on each step of the way is the freedom required by the mind. People need choices. They need choices over their health care. They need choices over, if they're in the healthcare industry, over how to do their work. Everything human beings require to live well has to be produced by human work. And human work can only be done when people are free to choose, when they're free to do their own thinking and act by their own judgment. And we have to view, I think, every issue in this space and in every other space, every issue of policy through that lens. Whose thinking is being preempted? Whose ability to act on their thinking is being flustered? What kinds of thinking about how to organize, how to deliver this service, not just at the level of, is this drug good or bad, but like, is this research program good or bad? Is this way of capitalizing a research program good or bad? What kinds of thinking like that are being prevented? Where do we see those things being cut off? And then what can we do to loosen the chains? What can we do to give people more scope for this kind of action? Understanding this as a step towards liberation. That's how I think we have to think about it. I think we have to understand also that this is something in which we can and should all be united. We won't be, because people hold the premises that we're our brother's keeper, and that what it is to keep our brother is to give him his pittance of gruel, rather than to give him the freedom he needs to create the values he wants for himself. But the respect in which we can and should be on the same side as this is not a situation in which it's doctors versus patients, or insurance companies versus hospitals, or drug companies versus something else. Every one of these organizations, as they exist and as they understand their interests in the current economy, is in some sense set at odds with one another. They're set at odds with one another. They have interests and interest groups conflicting, and there are organizations trying to get prices down from insurance companies, and insurance companies, everybody's lobbying different organizations for different laws, and the system of laws and regulations is so complex that nobody understands it. Not the people in it, not the analysts of it. It's a maze of horrors. But there's a more fundamental interest at stake. We all have an interest in living under a system where we can pursue our own health by our own judgment. And anybody who's in the healthcare profession for honest reasons, anyone who's interested in developing drugs, in figuring out ways to finance the development of drugs, in serving patients as a doctor, in figuring out how to organize doctors profitably to make money serving patients, in figuring out how to advocate for patients' needs, anyone who's interested in doing any of these things, not because of the details of the incentives right now, but because they want to make a life doing this kind of work, needs to know that it's possible to make an honest living doing these kinds of things. If only we were free to interact with one another only voluntarily, and to find the kinds of interactions that would let us all formulate and achieve our goals for our own health. That's what it looks like to liberate the mind in medicine. I stepped on my ending. So I'll take a question or two if there's time, and then we'll go to Dr. Amish Adalja, if you can get his slides up and ready.
In a form that you can actually afford to get. And there you go.
So there's the question of who I'm talking to and whether I'm giving them the right message. I don't think anybody's going to come and listen to me who has the set of concerns you're evincing. Just why are things so expensive? I think there are people who will be listened to if they're addressing those concerns. I think the kind of platform I have, the title of this conference, the kind of people I'm able to gather here are not those people. They're people who sense that there's something wrong with the field not being free enough. And what I'm trying to do is say what I think that amounts to at the deepest level, and what it looks like to organize one's thinking of medicine around that insight. Now, what would it mean then to create a movement organized around that insight? You'd have to reach out to all of the different people who are ill-served in different ways by the medical field. And you'd have to talk to them about why they're so ill-served. And it's true, most people aren't going to figure out new things. But most people can and should be taught to value the freedom that's required to do that. Not because they're going to be the person who invents the iPhone or who comes up with antibiotics, but but because they know that only if people are free to do that will new things be being offered to them. Will new things become more available more cheaply all the time? Will their sense of options that are within their ability to discern get better and better? People don't, there's a division of labor, and there's a division of labor about decision making. Right? It's not the case that if we didn't have the centralized FDA, everybody could or should review every medicine on their own and decide what to take. It would be ridiculous. Not even every doctor could do that, or not even if every 100 or 1,000 doctors or medical practice could do it. There obviously have to be large decision-making bodies that put in all the work to come up with sets of recommendations, which recommendations then other people consume and make their decisions. But what we have is an ossified system where people who have better ideas about how to do those things can't do them, can't implement them, can't act on them. And so the options that you get offered are stale and not thought out. And there aren't enough of them. Probably, in a better world, there'd just be one or two options on most things that had any kind of currency to them, because that would be what would be selected by a market, what would be selected by the kinds of consensus of the people who are spending their time and effort thinking about this. Like there's, Android and Apple are pretty much the two phone operating systems people have, not 100 million, etc. But those are systems that rise to the top in a situation where people who have ideas for better things are free to act on them, and where the incentives of everybody in the industries are able to align on coming up with what are the best things that are most anticipate and serve most people's needs, all things considered. And that's what I think we're lacking in the healthcare industry. Okay, we are now, I think, over time, so I'll have time to answer more questions later as part of a panel. And I bring up now Dr. Amos Chagall.